So this is Hebrews chapter 5, the scripture for the 19th of October. Chapter 5 is one of those in-between chapters. These are the chapters I was irritated about, I think, a few days ago in chapter 3, where you don't quite get a full idea on either side. You get the second half of one idea and maybe the first inklings of another. It's chapters like this that make chapter divisions irritating sometimes in the book of Hebrews. But this in-between chapter concludes the argument from chapter 4 about the nature of Jesus as a high priest, while also introducing the topic of falling away from grace, which I said we'd talk more about in chapter 6. We'll get to that and more fully develop that tomorrow. But first, we got to deal with what it means for Jesus to be our great high priest. Now, there are two offices, or I guess you'd call them two orders of priesthood, according to the author of the book of Hebrews. Now, let me caution you, if any of you have background with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they've taken these two orders of priesthood and have begun using them a little differently than I'm going to use them today. I think that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons as they're sometimes commonly called, you can receive the priesthood of Aaron, and that's maybe the first ordination that folks can receive, and then receive the priesthood of Melchizedek. I would suggest, and I think the author of Hebrews would suggest, that we aren't eligible to be priests in the order of Melchizedek. We're eligible to be Christians, which means trying to emulate Jesus Christ, and any priesthood we get would be through Jesus, not through Melchizedek. But if you have any questions about that or have had interactions with the LDS Church around this, you can feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to speak with you more about it. So there's the Aaronic priesthood on the one hand, there's the Melchizedekian priesthood on the other. These orders have similar functions in terms of being an intermediary between God and humans, but they manifest themselves in two different ways. We'll talk more about Melchizedek once we get to chapter 7, but if you want to learn more about him now, you can always read his story, which you can find in Genesis chapter 14. It begins with a clash of kings, but then it goes, I think, from verses 17 to 20, you've got Abraham greeting Melchizedek in peace, and there's some interesting stuff that goes on there. Now, as you may know, Aaron was the first high priest of Israel. And you can see the people of Israel preparing Aaron and preparing for the high priestly vestments in Exodus, and I believe that's between chapters 25 and 31. It'll be somewhere in there. Now, the role of the high priest, and in this case Aaron, Moses' brother, his role, was to offer sacrifices and prayers to God on behalf of the people. The high priest, in other words, was the primary point of contact between God and human beings. Now, the high priest wasn't expected to be perfect. He's coming to God from among people, stained by sin, and so the high priest is not going to be perfect. And so the high priest was expected to clean himself, offering sacrifices for his own sin along with the sin of the people. He was in need of as much grace as the people were, and so was himself an imperfect mediator, not a great channel through which grace could flow, in other words. Maybe you could think of it that way. Now, Jesus filled the same role. However, he didn't need to absorb grace for his sin from God, as he never sinned. So that made Jesus a much more perfect channel to distribute grace to human beings. And what was before sort of finite grace with an expiration date through the system of sacrifices, what was before that is through Jesus Christ now an infinite unexpiring grace that we receive from God, sort of in full capacity, you could think of it as. Instead of having a pipe that's full of holes that doesn't really bring a whole bunch of water to you, that would be Aaron. Jesus is a pipe that has no holes in it, is perfectly done, just a hole on one side and on the other to channel God's grace. Now, Jesus was not a high priest by blood or by lineage. A high priest came from the line of Levi, usually, and Jesus' line was that of Judah. But Jesus was appointed as such. This is part of serving in the order of Melchizedek, that you're a priest not by blood, but by God's choice. And like I said, we'll talk more about that in a couple chapters. We also see that through his suffering, Jesus was made perfect. Be on the lookout for this phrase throughout the rest of the book of Hebrews, being made perfect. They'll reappear a few times through Hebrews. By using Psalm 2 and then also Psalm 110, both of which the author also references in chapter 1, the author of Hebrews is tying together Jesus' kingly role in Psalm 2 and his priestly role in Psalm 110. Both of these are essential to his character. Now we too are called to be made more perfect through our learning and through our actions. And I think this is what frustrates the author of Hebrews beginning in verse 11 of chapter 5. If we were growing, then we would bear fruit. We'd begin to eat solid food as children do instead of just drinking milk. In other words, there comes a time when we need to develop as Christians. That's what all healthy living organisms do. And if we're going to be healthy living organisms, we need to develop, change, and grow as well. So I wonder, in what ways are you being made perfect as a Christian? That's all for Hebrews chapter 5. Tomorrow on the 20th of October, we'll look at Hebrews chapter 6. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.